I told you, everydayers. I told you that getting the pitching was gonna cost big. And man, was I right. Jeff and I are digging into the free agent pitching market on today's Locked On Reds.
You are Locked On Reds, your daily Cincinnati Reds podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, and welcome into the Locked On Reds podcast. My name is Jeff Carr. He is Steven Offenbaker, and we are lifelong Cincinnati Reds fans that have turned an addiction to this team into information for you. I want to thank you for making Locked On Reds part of your day. Locked On Reds is, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team every single day, and we are free and available on all podcasting platforms. On today's Locked On Reds podcast, there was a starting pitcher and a relief pitcher that were signed off the free agent market on Monday. They're starting to bring this insane pitching market into focus for the Reds, and we're going to look at why it's going to cost to get the Reds where they need to go this offseason. We're also going to look at the guys that were non-tendered last Friday. I mentioned on Monday's episode that we're going to discuss this a little bit more when Steve returns, about Derek Law and Reiver San Martin and Nick Senzel all getting the boot. And later on, Brandon Phillips makes his debut on Cooperstown's Hall of Fame ballot. We're going to look at that, and we are also going to look at another Hall of Fame hopeful and how his vote may give us a clue as to how Joey Votto's vote can go in, 6-7 years, whatever it might be. Before we get to all of that, wanted to thank you for joining us here on today's episode this Thanksgiving week. It's amazing, Steve, that we are already here to Thanksgiving week. Like, before we know it, it's going to be opening day. It's insane how time.
It was crazy fast.
It just flies by. And I mean, Reds Fest is going to be here in like less than 2 weeks. Yeah, basically 2 weeks. So yeah, the winter is flying on by. And with that, the slow burn of the MLB hot stove and the wonderful free agent market is starting to finally smolder a little bit, because Lance Lynn signed, Reynaldo López signed, and boy, is this pitching market intense.
I told you it was going to be expensive, and
Never
we talked about it was going to be expensive, whether we're talking about prospect capital or Bob's money. Now, look, I want to be completely clear. I don't care how much of Bob's money that Nick Krall goes out and spends. I hope he spends it all. And if that's what the pitching costs, that's what the pitching costs. But I do think the signings of both López and Lynn bring in crystal clear exactly what it's going to look like if the Reds are going to make a move in the free agent market for pitching. And knowing how this team operates, knowing how this team spins traditionally, I think it can kind of start to set our expectations, what's realistic for the Reds to go out and do now. Because if this is what Lance Lynn costs, if you're going to go sign Blake Snell, oh boy,
You might be talking 30.
Yeah, for sure.
30
So for me, I mean, we should get into the nuts and bolts of it a little bit, Jeff, and talk about what these guys did. Lance Lynn signed a 1-year, $10 million deal. No big deal, right? But wait, there's more. There's a club option for a second year, a $1 million buyout, and incentives built into this contract that for Lance Lynn, he could make $26 million over 2 years playing for the St. Louis Dirty Birds down there in the Gateway City. So that's kind of the floor of the free agent pitching market that the Reds should be looking at. They shouldn't be looking for anybody worse than Lance Lynn. This is what I'm saying. So anybody that they're going to go out and sign is going to cost more money. And I hope they spend it, but that's awful pricey for the way that this club operates.
And to put this into perspective, because according to our friends over at SpotTrack.com, they have market value estimations on free agents and what they could cost on an annual basis. They expected Lance Lynn to sign somewhere around $7 million per year. So the fact that, and again, it's incentive laden, but the fact that at the end of this, he could have made what's closer to $13 million per year. I mean, you're talking about just the kind of market where Nick Krall is going to have to be aggressive in this. And I believe, so let's unpack this, because I know that there's a lot of Reds fans that have the disposition. They know, they remember, they see it all the time. This Reds team says they want to improve, but they're not going to spend to do it. I think Nick Krall's got the budget. He knows how much he can spend. So within the constraints of that budget, he has the autonomy to go out and do it. And I think that that's still going to end up with improvements. It might dial back necessarily the expectations. I don't necessarily think they're going to go out and get one of these $25 million a year guys, but I still think that they're going to spend the most on one free agent this offseason than they have in their entire franchise's history, mostly because what they need is what everybody's buying. Because let's also look at Reynaldo López, because Lance Lynn's a starter, and the statistics, the surface level statistics on Lance Lynn was he had a 5.7 ERA last year, and he allowed over 2 homers per 9 innings. There were some metrics and some analytics that said that that was a little bit unlucky. His xFIP was actually 4.5, and he had the highest homer to fly ball ratio of his career last year, but still not necessarily something you want to shell out a ton of money for. Reynaldo López, on the other hand, was a relief pitcher. He was a relief pitcher for, well, the Angels and the Guardians, and he moved around a bunch last year, but he was a relief pitcher for the White Sox for a year or so before going to Los Angeles. The Braves are actually signing him to start. They're going to stretch him out. They're going to work him out as a starter and see where he is in spring training. Because of that, they gave him a 3-year, $30 million deal, $10 million per, for a guy that Spot Track had at just over $6 million per.
That might be a starter. He could maybe be a starter. And listen,
he's a talented Luke Weaver.
Right, for sure. And a little note on Lance Lynn. You look at his ERA, you look at his pitching performance. Remember that he spent a majority of last year pitching in the disaster that was the Chicago White Sox organization. During his time there, 6-9, a 6.47 ERA and 21 starts. Goes over when he was pitching in Los Angeles, much better. Now, of course, he's going to have a much better win-loss. That lineup is ridiculous. 7-2 for the Dodgers, but a 4.36 ERA in 11 starts. I think he just liked the National better. I think that it's not ace material, but it makes it a little more clear why maybe St. Louis was willing to take a flyer on him. I don't think White Sox Lance Lynn is really Lance Lynn. That's what I'm saying.
I would agree with that. And I mean, he's a guy that back during the trade deadline, I wanted the Reds to go get, because he was on an expiring deal and he looked like it wouldn't cost that much prospects to go get him. So when I saw him sign this free agent deal, I was just like, oh boy, if this is what we are looking at, like Nick Krall has got to come to the table, not only with, hey, Cincinnati loves their baseball, but he's going to have a pretty big check along with him. It's not as if they're just going to come here for peanuts.
What's realistic? You and I have talked about this a little bit on past episodes, but we look at where the Reds payroll stands right now as far as we know it, and we look at what we think might be available. Again, Nick Krall has declined every time that he's asked to talk about what the budget number looks like, but I think 40 million is a realistic number that they could spend this offseason, and that would still put them south of 90, correct? Yep. If they spend 40 million,
would put them at that's not even 86.
That's not even league average for payroll. So they could go as high as 50. At $50 million, you could sign a $25 million a year starting pitcher, go get a couple relievers and an outfielder. You could do all three things if you're willing to spend $50 million. If they spend $50 million, they're still below league average in payroll. So I think that fits everybody's narrative. It fits Bob and Phil's narrative about being a small market and you can't spend like the big boys in New York, but it also fits their narrative of we're going to be a competitive team and we're going to put a good product on the field and we're going to go get what we need to go get to put championship baseball back in Cincinnati. It does all those things. Now, $50 million is a lot of cabbage, both the figurative kind of cabbage and Bob Castellini's.
Does it have to be the red cabbage at that point? Do you have to like start out in color?
It's got to be green. Got to be green cabbage, buddy. Got to be green cabbage. That's a lot of money, and I think that's the high side. I can't imagine that the Castellinis were willing to authorize more than 50. 40 sounds more realistic to me, but you know, Bob wants. Listen. This is going to sound terrible. I don't care. Bob wants to win before he dies. Yeah. That's the goal. And he's an old man. He's in his 80s now. There's not a lot of time left for him to deliver on the things he said he wanted to accomplish as the owner of this team. If ever there was a time to go for it and for him to fulfill that promise, it's this offseason heading into 2024. It's the 2024 team. That's the one that has the best opportunity to get him down on a field, hoisting a World Series trophy before it's too late.
Exactly. And because of that, I firmly believe I'm in the camp that believes that he has given the autonomy to Nick Krall to go do the voodoo that he does so well. It's just how much is that number? I tend to believe that you're right. It's like between 40 and $50 million. I cannot believe that they would give less than that, because if they gave a budget that was less than that, then they have to understand they're not going to improve all the areas that they need to improve. They're going to have to leave some up to chance. And everything that Nick Krall has been saying this offseason, there's been some great articles in the Inquirer from Gordon Wittenmeyer and Charlie Goldsmith that Nick Krall understands that's not the way he's got to attack this. So I think that we're going to see some big moves here. But, dude, this pitching market is intense.
You are correct. Listen, going, gone. Great baseball phrase. Well, the Reds non-tendered 3 last week, and they are going, gone. We're going to tell you who it is and whether or not it was a good move for the team. Coming up next. Today's episode is brought to you in part by FanDuel. Score often this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets back with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's right. Throw a $5 moneyline bet down on any of your favorite NFL teams this week for the win. And when you hit that puppy, you're going to get $150 in bonus bets. That's right. $150 back in bonus bets if your team wins. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action than right now. The app is so easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options, including spreads, player props, over-unders, Jeff's favorite, although he doesn't know how to click the under, and so much more. You can also combine prop bets on a game into a single game parlay for even more fun. FanDuel has World Series odds posted for next year already. The Reds are behind the Cardinals, the Brewers, and the Cubs. The disrespect continues. Cincinnati currently 47-1 to win the World Series next year. Get in on that now before it changes. That line is going to move once this offseason pans out a little bit more, and you don't want to be left behind. You can take the Bengals on the money line for your first bet if you want to. I don't know. You got to win to get the 150 back in bonus bets. So proceed with caution. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to kick off your betting on the NFL season. That's over at FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. Locked On has launched its first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. It's Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts from the Locked On network, plus the national shows that cover the league every day. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. All right, Jeff, going, gone is what I said there in the last segment. And I picked that 3-word phrase because 3 guys are gone. No surprise here in that Nick Senzel was non-tendered. You and I spent a ton of time talking about this leading up to it. It seemed like the most logical option based on the things that Nick Krall had been saying about Jose Barrero, the things that he'd been saying about roster construction, and the things that we saw the Reds do with Nick Senzel towards the end of 2023 in sending him down to Louisville and seemingly being done with him before injuries forced their hands to bring him back up. Also gone, Derek Law from this bullpen. And you talked about this briefly and speculated that he could be a non-tender candidate, and we weren't really sure how that would play out. But lo and behold, you kind of hit that one. Derek Law, non-tendered by the Reds, and Reiver San Martin. This one, I ho-hum a little bit. I don't know that this is a big move either way, but nonetheless, Reiver San Martin gone. Could still come back in some type of free agent minor league signing if the Reds so choose. Where do you want to start with this? I think Nick Senzel is the biggest name, and probably ultimately his non-tender brings to a close one of the more recent, bigger disappointments of a player that we hyped and hyped and hyped that just didn't quite pan out.
Yeah, and it was a bummer. And I talked about yesterday on the podcast when you weren't with me that, you know, it was a bummer to see it end. It's kind of a signaling that you cannot always trust that every prospect's going to pan out. I mean, he goes on a long list of names that just continue to be evidence against that. But also, I think the big picture of all three of these guys is that the Reds are getting ready to make some moves, because Derek Law was fine as a relief pitcher. We talked about some of the stuff he did a little bit with smoke and mirrors. Like, his ERA looked nice, but when you really got into the nitty gritty, the strikeout rate, the walk rate, the hard hit stuff that he gave up, like, it was all kind of pointing to the fact he was getting lucky. And then with Reiver San Martin, I think my biggest surprise with him is just the fact that he's a lefty. Like, I feel like a team really has to believe that they can do better if they're going to get rid of a lefty. Sam Moll, pretty good. Alex Young, decent. But there's options out there on the open market that the Reds could go improve their left-handed relief pitching pretty easily by just throwing some money at them. And Reiver San Martin's dealt with injuries as well. So I think for me, the big overarching feeling with all of this is the Reds are making room for some moves that they're going to make here, because now they've only got 37, once again, on the 40-man roster. So when they go and they make that move, they don't have to have a corresponding, well, we're going to say an awkward goodbye to this guy because we just signed somebody who's much better than him.
The move with Derek Law, you know, in hindsight now that it's been made and you really kind of dig into it, you're right. His numbers, lucky, maybe. This is what I know. When you look at his numbers and you combine it with our eye test, right? When we watch Derek Law pitch in 2023, I never felt secure when he came into a game. He was not a guy coming out of the bullpen where I was like, all right, we got it, we're moving forward. That was not Derek Law. We talked about this bullpen could have 2 to 3 slots in it for upgrade, for ways that Nick Krall could make the team better in 2024. This cements that there's now 3 spots really that he can go out and fill. One of those guys needs to be a left-handed pitcher. And then you go out and you get the other 2 best relievers that you can get. And that tremendously upgrades this bullpen as far as I'm concerned. The move with Reiver San Martin, he never really quite just lived up to the potential that he kind of showed us. He never quite was what the Reds needed him to be as a left-hander. And I think that he's not going to draw a ton of interest on the open market. I would not be shocked to see him sign and come back for a more team-friendly
minor league deal or something.
With a minor league deal, an invite out to Goodyear, and just see what he can put together. Maybe it'll motivate him a little bit to put it together. And if that doesn't happen, if he's gone, well, I don't think it's a tremendous loss either. The Nick Senzel thing, you know, I will say this because we've beat on this for a while, but if you want to understand just how special what happened in 2023 with all of the rookie call-ups, if you want to understand just how special that was, look at the career of Nick Senzel, because more often than not, things go the way of Senzel, not the way of Matt McLean, not the way of Noel V. Marte, not the way of CES, not the way of Ellie De La Cruz. So put that in perspective, because the Reds hit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It just kept coming and they kept performing well. So, you know, shout out once again to the robbed executive of the year, Nick Krall, for putting together and bringing in those players.
Exactly. And I think the biggest thing for me, and I was just thinking as you were talking about this, I think, isn't Reiver San Martin the last bastion of the Aroldis Chapman trade?
Yeah, I think that's correct.
So I think it was Rookie Davis and him and some other guy that never made the major leagues at all. So yeah, just that's a bummer. But yeah, Nick Senzel, I mean, it's such a bummer. And I looked at some different things, and I just keep using that word, but you know, like back when he was coming up through the minor leagues, there were so many scouts that were saying this dude has the potential to hit close to 300. This dude has the potential to be a top of the lineup type guy. And we just never really saw that. And there was a lot of finagling and different things that the Reds did with his position and his service time. And then there was injuries, and there were injuries that were questionable, just how injured he was. And there's so many different things. The saga of Nick Senzel, honestly, and as much as I hate to say it, the saga of Nick Senzel for this team is disappointment based on what he could have been to what he ended up being to what the Reds kind of, I don't know, maybe jerked around a little bit, if we're being honest. This was a situation, because I've seen plenty of fans' reaction to this of, good riddance, see you later. This is not all on Nick Senzel. This is on the Reds a little bit as well. But to see it in like this is just, it's a bummer, because it now brings into question, you know, who else are we going to be talking about like this in a couple of years?
You know, I tweeted this out, and I'll say it again. You know, I was always in Nick Senzel's corner. I always wanted him to be successful.
You had his dad on early.
I did when over at Reds Alert, that when he got called up that same weekend, had a long talk with his dad on the show about, you know, Nick's journey and it culminating in a call up to the Reds. I've always rooted for him, and I will continue to root for him. I hope he goes somewhere. I hope he catches on. I hope he finally is able to put it together and has a tremendous career moving forward. And I hope that as long as he doesn't go to the Cardinals.
Yeah. Or the Pirates or something like that.
The Brewers, Cubs. Yeah. Just go to the American League. Go to the AL.
I did see MLB trade rumors, and I mentioned this yesterday as well. Said that speculative landing spots for him, and Steve, see if you can spot the one that doesn't quite fit here. The A's, the Royals, the Tigers, the Nationals, and the Diamondbacks.
Oh, one of those is different than the rest. Yeah, he's not going to Arizona, folks. He is not going to Arizona, but those other teams could be good fits.
Just a little bit. So, with that being said, let's look at something else, because we talked about this a little bit with non-tenders and stuff like that. Let's talk about Hall of Fame stuff, because Brandon Phillips makes his debut on the ballot for Cooperstown, and why one other player's experience with the voting may give us a clue as to how Joey Votto's Hall of Fame process will go here in a few years. That's coming up next. Before we get to that, you can follow us in between episodes. You can follow me on Twitter, and you can follow Steve on Twitter or X or whatever you call it. You can follow me at Jeff Carr with 3 Fs. You can follow Steve at S. Offenbaker with 2 Fs. And you can follow the show at Locked On Reds. Also, bookmark the new Sports Illustrated Fan Nation website, InsideTheReds.com. I'm a writer over there. Steve, maybe soon. We'll have more on that.
Coming soon to a website.
Soon, yeah. Lots more Reds analysis and news, and kind of reacting to some of the moves that the Reds may or may not make and things like that. It's all over at InsideTheReds.com, and you can join the Locked On Reds Discord page. We've got the link to that down in the description of this episode. A lot of great folks talking Reds baseball all year long. All right, Brandon Phillips on the ballot, Steve. Look, I loved Brandon Phillips as a Red, but I don't necessarily know that he's a Cooperstown guy.
Let's just squash this right now. He is not a Hall of Famer. Look, I have,
Reds Hall of Famer.
He's 100% a Reds Hall of Famer. He is not a Cooperstown National Baseball Hall of Famer. Look, I have a pretty hard and fast rule when I look at players in Hall of Fame eligibility. If you have 60 or more in WAR, and we can have a conversation about if that number is different for catchers on this episode or a future episode. But if you're 60 or above in WAR as a position player or as a player in general, non-catcher, you're a Hall of Famer. Brandon Phillips, for his entire career, 28.4 in WAR, just a little shy of my 60 benchmark. He doesn't come close. He doesn't come close for me in being a Hall of Famer. But as you say, though, a tremendous talent when he was here in Cincinnati. So much fun to watch. You know, whether he was fighting with the Cardinals or fighting with C. Trent or fighting with everybody else, he was fun to watch. And I do think he's a Reds Hall of Famer. I think that he will very soon be a Reds Hall of Famer. But no, get that Cooperstown talk out of here.
No, and that's a tough thing for me, because, I mean, you talk about putting him in the Reds Hall of Fame. He's going to be in there with multiple Gold Gloves. He's going to be in there with a Silver Slugger. He's had a nice career, but it's not the Hall of Nice Careers. It's the Hall of Fame, like the best of the best, the top end. And as much as we love him as a Red, when you compare him to other second basemen, there's a second baseman on this ballot that's much better than him in Chase Utley. So it's going to be kind of hard for me to see anybody throwing a vote his way. Like I hate to say that, but I'm not going to be surprised if the vote goes through and he doesn't get any votes.
Well, it isn't coming from C. Trent. He's not getting C. Trent's vote.
No, he's not.
No, you mentioned Chase Utley for comparison's sake, Jeff. Chase Utley's WAR is 64.5. So, he's three times better nearly than Brandon Phillips, 2.5 times better than Brandon Phillips. And for me, Chase Utley is a surefire Hall of Famer at 64.5 in WAR. So, yeah, you asked me that off air and I thought maybe he'd get a vote from somebody, but you might be right. He might not get any votes at all as far as the Cooperstown ballot goes.
But to see his name on there, I mean, that's pretty cool. I'll tell you what, and we mentioned catcher, Joe Mauer also debuts on this ballot. And whenever you were asking me, you're throwing up names saying who's going to make it, I said Joe Mauer will make it. Joe Mauer falls under that 60 WAR, and probably a conversation for a different time as to, how catchers compare to other positions and things like that. But I do believe this, how his voting experience goes will be something of a preview, maybe a teaser trailer for Joseph Daniel Votto once his name appears on the ballot. Joey has more WAR and he's not a catcher, but there's something about that range of WAR that has a lot of question marks.
He was a catcher. You put some respect.
Boy, they drafted him.
When you talk about Joseph Daniel, no, I'm kidding. Yeah, look, Joe Mauer comes in at 55.2 in WAR. And you're talking about a 15-year career, 10 of which he spent as a catcher. His final 5 seasons, he was predominantly a first baseman. I think he caught in his final game that I think the Twins ran him out there for an inning at catcher as a goodbye gesture.
He ran back and iced his knee. Yeah.
Yeah, correct. So, probably you're right. Different show when we talk about the benchmarks. But for me, 10 years as a catcher, 55 WAR, slash line for a career that was predominantly a catcher of 306, 388, 439. I think he's a Hall of Famer. Now, he's one of the rare candidates where I would move off my hard and fast 60 rule and say this guy would get in. But when you look at that and you're having those conversations, when you look at Chase Utley's WAR and say that, yeah, that guy is definitely going to be a Hall of Famer. And then you look at Joe Mauer's WAR at 55 and say, given his circumstance, yeah, he's a Hall of Famer. Joey Votto is at 64.4 in WAR right now. Could add to that if he catches on somewhere next season. I don't see how Joey Votto is not a first ballot Hall of Famer when you look at these players and the narratives that surround them and what everybody else says outside of Cincinnati. I think Joey Votto is going to continue to suffer from the long time narratives that were verbalized against him from people that probably should have been supporting him more, that skewed the national perception of Joey Votto, because I would like to think that the writers would do their due diligence, and that's hard to say, their due diligence, and look at his career and his numbers and make a decision for themselves. But what we have determined with baseball writers and their voting is they're lazy, they're self-serving, and they don't do the right thing. So I'm a little concerned about it. I hope you're right. And that in the time between now and when Joey's name actually appears on this ballot, maybe we'll get some better writers, or maybe we'll have changed the process. But Joey Votto deserves to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. Adrian Beltre's on this ballot this year, first ballot Hall of Famer. I think Chase Utley will be a first ballot Hall of Famer. Joe Mauer could squeak in. I told you this off air. I'm really tired of this first ballot, second ballot, third ballot stuff.
Yes.
Their stats don't change. Like, if you look at the ballot and you think that guy's eventually going to be a Hall of Famer, mark the box and don't make it about yourself, baseball writers. Just check the box and let's get it done. Let's move this thing forward.
And I've heard enough arguments about that too, where it's just like, well, it's compared to the other. No, it's not. Like, is player A Hall of Famer? It doesn't matter if player A was better than player B, or he played in a different division than player C. Like it's not a comparison game. It's what are his stats compared to what you think a Hall of Famer is. It's not what is Joe Mauer's stats compared to Andrew Jones' stats compared to Chase Utley's stats. Like I've heard too much of that I find to just be absolute drivel. And yeah, that's another subject that we could probably get on a soapbox with here. But I think what we're saying is we're banking an idea for in the future where we just talk about, some Hall of Fame practices that need to change, and maybe, discussing the merits of catching as opposed to other positions. But on the whole, I look at this and I say, Joey Votto should absolutely be a Hall of Famer. And I 100% agree with you that, I've talked to fans of other teams that have been like, so what's the deal with Joey Votto? And I'm like, what do you mean? And then this has been in years past, not necessarily free agent, the club option deal. They were like, what's the deal with Joey Votto? I thought he was like super good. Why is everybody like kind of down on him in Cincinnati? And I'm like, well, not everybody is. It's just there happens to be a couple of other folks that tend to have a platform. They can get up and talk about it that have skewed some other people's opinions of the man, who is actually a very good baseball player, who's actually one of the best that we've ever seen. And we love him. But there are some people that want him to be something he's not. They keep comparing him. They love the idea of him and not so much who he is himself. But yeah.
And I think moving forward now, as each of these Hall of Fame classes come out, from now moving forward, the exercise for me and for you and probably for anybody that knows baseball is going to be start comparing Joey to the new guys on the ballot and see what kind of success those players have in election, because hopefully we will see that trend in the voting that we want to go Joey's way. We'll see that trend in the new voters coming in that can look at Joey's numbers and really appreciate what he was able to do in the hardest era that there's ever been in baseball to hit a baseball. Joey Votto excelled. So I really hope that the writers see it. It is going to be something we talk about, not just this offseason, but for years to come while we wait for the eventual day that Joey's inducted into Cooperstown. And I know I'm going. I know that Jeff's going. We're going. So we're going to be all over that, folks.
Yeah, and it also brings into relief another topic for another Hall of Fame episode day of, is Joey Votto going to be the last Reds Hall of Famer? Because right now, can't really see anybody at this moment. Anyway, that's going to be where we ended on that bombshell. It's time to end today's podcast. Thanks, everybody, so much for checking out today's Locked On Reds podcast. Make sure that you're following us on your favorite app and you're following us here on YouTube. You click that bell to get notified whenever we've got new content for you. And, by the way, speaking of YouTube, check out Locked On Sports Today 24/7 as Locked On brings you the very first ever 24/7 streaming sports channel on YouTube. That's Locked On Sports Today 24/7. Subscribe now and get all of your Locked On all day, every day. All right, Steve, coming up on tomorrow's podcast, we're going to talk about the progression of a methodical man known as CES. Until then, what can people expect from you and me?
We're going to keep monitoring the transactions. We're going to keep looking for the rumors. We're going to keep looking for the info. We're going to gather it all up and bring it right back here to keep you locked on Reds every single day. I'm guessing the baseball writers of America aren't coming to SI and asking you and I to be voters anytime soon.